I graduated from the United States Naval Academy, something most families would be proud of. Mine wasn't, at least not really. They said congratulations, smiled for a photo, then went right back to talking about my sister Emily's internship at the hedge fund. In my house, success only looked one way: spreadsheets, boardrooms, company shares. Military service, that was just a long detour before settling down and joining the real world. My father, Richard Ellison, ran a family investment firm with old money ties and newer ambitions. My mother, Claudia, was the type who hosted charity galas and remembered everyone's net worth better than their birthdays. My sister Emily was their star. She had the Ivy League degree, the polished accent, the perfect resume. She interned at Goldman at 19, got featured in a finance blog at 21, and had a private office in the family firm by 25. She wore her ambition like perfume, just strong enough to announce itself before she entered the room. I chose a different path. I didn't take over a department. I didn't wear blazers and heels or carry business cards with embossed logos. I wore a uniform. I got up before sunrise. I trained. I followed orders. At the time I graduated, I was just a junior officer with no flashy title, no medals. And to them, that meant I had failed in a polite, almost pitiful way. Desk job, probably, I once overheard my aunt say. Pushing papers. Or screens. Poor girl. I still remember, back then I was 23. Maya Ellison, Naval Academy senior, just 3 weeks away from graduation. I had flown home for a long weekend before final drills, thinking it might be my last real family dinner in a while. Maybe forever. No one ever asked me what I actually did. Not once. That night, I tried to tell Mum about a small win, just a training eval, but it mattered to me. I thought maybe this time she'd actually hear me. She smiled, nodded and said, "Oh, that reminds me we need to finalise the menu for Emily's birthday." Dad didn't even lift his eyes off his phone. "You should really think about coming home," he said. "Start under Emily. Learn how the business works. We're planning an expansion. If it goes well, you could move into a leadership role." Then he added, like it was a cherry on top, "Connor, remember him? He's back from Europe. Solid guy. I think you two would really hit it off." I didn't argue. I just nodded quietly. Because that was the moment I realised they never really saw me. Not as I was, only as who they wished I'd be. Still, there was one moment I really thought things might change my graduation ceremony. The academy sent a formal invitation to my parents. I had been chosen to give the commencement speech. It wasn't just about pride. I wanted them to see me just once doing something that mattered. I told them over dinner, trying to sound casual, but secretly hoping they'd be surprised. Excited, even. They weren't. Emily looked at Dad. Mum sipped her wine. Dad finally spoke. "We'll be there," he said. "Emily and I have something scheduled that morning, but we'll try to make it about an hour before the ceremony starts. Your mum can stay the whole time, and of course we'll be at the reception after." I laughed. I thought he was joking. When I realised he wasn't, I stopped laughing. "You're seriously going to miss my graduation speech?" I asked louder than I meant to. "Everyone takes pictures before the ceremony. The party after is just drinks and noise. We'll take pictures the next day," he said calmly, like he was solving a scheduling conflict. "It's not a big deal." That was when I stood up and left. No dramatic scene, no shouting. I just walked away from the table and didn't look back. It wasn't the first time I felt like I didn't belong, but it was the first time I knew they had already written me out of the story. I spent most of the graduation lunch myself, perched at the kiddie table of adult ceremony, no name card, no real view of the stage wedged next to the water cooler station. I could feel the hum of small talk around family tables filled with framed photos of Emily and her classmates, but not a single photo of me anywhere. When I asked Mum, she glanced over her shoulder and said casually, "I thought one of her friends took it." Her voice was polite, like explaining why the salad was warm, not like someone dismissing a daughter. Dad rose to speak in that curated way he did. Voice, smooth smile, practiced. "We're so proud of Emily," he began, sweeping his gaze across the table, avoiding mine. "She's chosen a path of brightness. Financial markets, philanthropy, public image. Some people choose darkness and call it courage. But that's not where she's headed." His words landed like a hammer's crack. I kept my head down, pretending to sip my iced tea. That's when Emily decided to add her own little tribute, something sweet with veneer. "She's so good at being invisible," she said, patting my hand too softly. "Very strong in silence." She offered a smile she must have practiced in front of a mirror. The table laughed politely. I smiled back, mouth dry. There was nothing polite in my chest. Then someone stepped forward. A man in a crisp suit and navy tie. He stood tall next to Emily's girlfriend, a longtime friend from Georgetown. He wore a pin on his lapel, small gold oval, with USA etched inside. He looked at me, eyes sharp with recognition. "Mom," he asked, "I served under you in Djibouti." His voice didn't shout, just cut through the polite chatter, like someone flicking a spotlight. The table quieted. Forks stopped clinking. The air went thin. My hand froze on my phone. I forced a nod. He straightened, then smoothing his jacket. Not a guest. Not someone there for Emily. Someone there because he respected me, not the quiet child. "Commander Ellison," he said, and used my rank. I felt the ripple of it. I braced myself. The room felt too warm. My throat tightened. He wasn't saying it to embarrass me, just recognition, just truth. I closed my eyes for a moment, flashback to the last time I tried sharing something with Mom. 7 years ago, I sat across from her in our family's big dark wood dining room. I had just received a commendation for my first Intel intercept, a small assignment on a hidden terracell. I told her slowly, carefully explaining that it might seem small, but to me, it meant I was doing something bigger than myself. She looked up, but her face shielded behind a glass of Chardonnay gave away nothing. Then she set the glass down and answered with a half smile. "That's nice, dear. My committee meeting next month is in the evenings. And, oh, did you pick a dress for Emily's gala?" She pivoted like a dancer. My victory was something to carry into the closet, not display on a shelf. That memory burned cooler now than 7 years earlier. I forced a smile back to the present. When I finally lifted my gaze, I saw the man, Aidan Reeve, watching me. He offered a short salute, crisp and respectful. A flicker of shame passed over my father's face, like he'd forgotten I existed for a moment. My mother sipped her drink. Emily touched my shoulder again this time, softer, unable to meet my eyes. I cleared my throat. "Thank you," I said, voice steady but soft. "Appreciate it." My fingers tightened around the glass. Hydration, focus, discipline. My old Navy drills kicked in quiet and precise. Aidan gave a slight nod and stepped away. The room slowly filled with small murmurs, uneasy laughter. Mum shifted in her seat, pulling out her phone. Emily turned to her father. Dad coughed, cleared his throat. "Anyway," he said, so proud of Emily seeing all this, the audience, the press. Bright trajectory ahead. I breathed out. The food arrived, plates of chicken and grilled vegetables. I ate without hunger. The table kept circling back to Emily's future London office board meetings, summer homes, engagement planning. And me, I sat in silence, invisible again, except for the ripple a name and uniform brought into the room. I sensed a shift, a line drawn. I wasn't the sideline soldier anymore. Not today. But it wasn't my fight to declare. At least not yet. I could feel my heart beating slow and sure. The ceremony ended and applause started. Emily gave one final plastic smile my way. I stood up, excused myself. Under polite gazes, I made my way out of that room, the same way I had left home before, only now with more weight behind my steps. In the parking lot, I took in the afternoon sun. The sound of distant car doors, the echo of the ceremony beyond heavy walls. I wondered if Emily even noticed I left. I didn't look back, But that afternoon wasn't the first time I'd felt like I'd been erased. It was just the first time I realised how quietly it had been done. I still remember that Christmas of 2012, just months after I'd been accepted to the Naval Academy. I was 22, freshly home on leave from field training, and had time to think between drills and midnight mass. I carved the wooden box over 2 late nights in the base workshop, sanding its edges one stroke at a time, staining it dark walnut. I popped in the lid, closed it tight, and wrapped it in holiday paper, certain it was something that carried more of me than any store-bought gift could. Downstairs, the Ellison living room smelled of pine and clove. Mum had orchestrated everything to exact precision. The tree, the table setting, the wine glasses laid just so. I unwrapped the box in front of her and waited for that same moment I'd felt when they handed me my academy acceptance letter. Maybe this time would be different. She opened it. Her eyes skimmed the wood grain. Then she looked at me and said, "It's sweet, Maya. But what do you want me to use it for?" That question landed heavy, so much effort, so many nights of carving, for a question that cost less than 2 seconds to speak. I forced a short laugh and said something small. "Maybe for jewellery, or your lipstick." She nodded, but never really looked like she wanted it. She set it aside and turned her attention to my sister Emily, who was already sipping champagne and talking about her upcoming internship. Later, Dad asked some small question about my summer assignment. I told him I'd been selected for a Naval Intelligence Unit counterintelligence work overseas. He paused, slightly asked what it involved, then shook his head. "That's dangerous," he said. "Why don't you think about law school?" "Your aunt did, that joined the firm, got comfortable. It's stable." The words were soft, but every syllable felt like a choice meant to keep me small. Emily, sitting by the fireplace in a red dress that made her look like Christmas morning, smiled and said, "You really like challenging yourself, huh? But I think you could do something easier, gentler." She laughed lightly, twirling a strand of her hair. There was no malice in her voice, just no affection either, only a quiet kind of distance. I finished my plate of roast turkey without offering more. The others passed the potatoes, talked about Emily's plans, took selfies by the tree. I sat silent, aware of the box tucked in my bag, the memory of sanding it still fresh in my hands, but doubting whether anyone would ever ask me about it. That night, I retreated upstairs. I closed the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the snow climbing the window pane. I wrapped my hands around a cup of hot cocoa, felt the cotton of my academy sweatshirt against my skin. I thought about the carver in me who had built that box, how easy it felt to measure and craft something real. And I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who could carry secrets, who could spend months in the field, unseen, but always watching. I understood something important that night. My family didn't want me. Not the real me. They wanted a version 1 that played by their rules and reflected back their pride. They wanted me to be Emily with a business degree. They needed me to stay small. They didn't ask what I did at sea in training in classrooms. They asked what was plan B, what came next that made sense to investors, to social circles, to parties. From then on, I stayed quiet at home. I waited for dinners to end. I talked less, shared less. I stopped carving at the workshop. I stopped making little things to give away because the weight of giving was heavier than the gift. But I didn't regret my path. I believed in what I was doing, in serving the Navy in patience, in discipline. I believed that I would show them a version of success they wouldn't be able to ignore, not because they acknowledged me, but because I'd be measured by something bigger, something real. That Christmas also taught me that silence could be armor, not only a wound. It taught me that the rest of the world wouldn't change because my family didn't understand. I had to find people who did, or become the kind of person they would see no matter where they stood. By the time the holidays ended, I carried my carved box home with me, unclaimed but unbroken. It sat on my dresser for months, a reminder of love I had given unconditionally and loss I didn't expect. But more than that, it reminded me I was still here, and I would keep carving my path even if their eyes never followed. It was nearly 2 years later, spring of 2014, when I received the envelope in the mail. I remember dropping it on my apartment counter and pausing. It was from my bank. My heart skipped. I'd just returned from a week of training exercises, exhausted but grounded. It took only a second glance at the bold text, "Notice of past due amount," to corkscrew my stomach. Inside was a statement, a significant line of credit under my name with purchases I didn't recognise. They had charged it to consulting services. A lot of consulting services. I stared at the numbers stacked below, unsettling. This wasn't a few $100s. It was thousands. Enough that it made sense my bank had flagged it. I called them immediately. My fingers shook as I listened to the recorded message to press 1 for account inquiries. When I finally reached an agent, I explained, "I didn't authorise this. I haven't applied for any line of credit." She asked for my name account number. After a few seconds of typing, she said, "Ma'am, the signature matches exactly." She sounded polite, disinterested even, but her words hung heavily. It was my signature on the documents. My name. My credit. I pressed harder, voice steady. "Are you sure I have records of my deployment in Djibouti at the same time the line was opened in Virginia?" She paused. I heard her open a new file. I'll refer this to our fraud department. But for now, the account is your responsibility." And before I could say more, she hung up. My hands went cold. I paced the living room of my DC rental. Deployed in Africa, but someone was opening accounts as me back home. Signing documents in my name. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't since Christmas 2012. This was identity theft, but from whom my instincts honed in the corridors of covert assignments kicked in. I emailed a trusted old colleague, Lieutenant Carter, who had access to secure logs. I asked him to trace any access to my Academy email account, the official channel during my last year, specifically looking for out-of-region logins, especially from government IP addresses or corporate backdoors. I phrased it carefully, not wanting to send alarm to those who shouldn't be trusted. Within 24 hours, Carter replied, "Maya, there's an access log from 2 years ago, March 2012, from your Academy email. IP resolves to a commercial address on K Street. The signature timestamp matches the credit application date, K Street, the hub of lobbying finance family offices." I stared at those words. A chill swept me. My father's office. Could it be I ran through possibilities, maybe someone hacked the system? But that login was deliberate and logged as verified by user. That suggested someone had access to my credentials or had impersonated me using malware or spoofing. Someone who knew exactly who I was, where I had been. I didn't confront my family then. I sat with it, collected documents, printed every access log, dates, IP ranges, login durations. I contacted a legal friend civilian counsel who had worked wrongful identity cases. I asked them quietly, what if the line of credit is real on paper, but not by choice? What if someone did this to make it seem like I disappeared? The lawyer frowned at the documents. "That's detailed," she said. "Someone had access. Someone who knew your travel schedule. Someone inside the network." She didn't question who she didn't have to. For weeks, I kept the truth close. I balanced training logs, secure records, and financial statements. My days were full: sunrise, physical training briefing, for covert simulation evenings reviewing logs. My nights were restless, haunted by a family dinner where I'd made space in my heart for acceptance, only to find costumed indifference. This was different. They weren't just ignoring me. This was appropriation. My next call was to a federal agent I'd met during a past secondment. I gave him the credit statement, IP logs, timestamp deployment records. He raised his hand. "Where did you get deployment sheets?" he asked. I said NATO authorized. He nodded. The room went serious. We'll investigate. That investigation triggered more questions. Who gave away my identity? Who had the logs, knew where I was, and signed documents so they could treat me as if I'd vanished? Their evidence all pointed to a Bing Street address tied to my father's limited partner corporation, the kind of company that arranged inheritances, foundation assets. My heartbeat had slowed not in fear, but in calculation. They'd taken my absence, borrowed my name, treated me as missing, a ghost with credit. But they hadn't counted on one thing: I was still the one in the arena. I had my credentials, my logs, my purpose. And soon, I'd have more. I closed the binders that night, the files stacked tall and neat. I touched the nameplate on my dresser, M. Ellison, the wood from my carved box still present as a reminder. I made a decision I would let them rise to drown me in their world of money, but I would drag them into my world of evidence, truth, and accountability. And I'd start with the quietest war, reclaiming my name. A week after discovering the fraud, I found myself standing behind the desk in our condo lobby. The clerk passed me a sealed envelope and said with a half smile, "Here's your new passport." That was fast. She stacked the documents neatly and glanced at my plain clothes. "I guess you're back in an office environment now," I gave her a nod, and thanked her. No correction, no explanation. The thought of telling her who I really was felt exhausting and pointless. That moment lingered in my mind. I held the passport in my hands, pages untouched, visa stamps, blank. But the person this represented, it wasn't the Maya they thought, and that's when I remembered another moment, the medal ceremony years before. I was 25, halfway through my deployment overseas. The small ceremony took place at dawn. My commanding officer pinned the ribbon to my chest in front of just a handful of other officers. I stood ramrod straight, shoulders tightened. Later, with adrenaline still in my veins, I called home from a secure line. My voice was careful. Mum answered after a few rings. "Hi, sweetie," she said. My chest swelled. "They gave it to me today," I said softly. "A commendation?" She paused before she answered. "That's lovely, darling. But, who even knows what that's for? If it's not about business success, what's the point?" She sounded polite, but her words carried a weight. I closed my eyes, holding the phone away from my ear, letting the medal's ribbon press against my palm. The silence between us hung tight. Then Emily's voice came. "No offence, sis, but nobody's following you on Instagram for medals." Her laugh cut through. "Mum and I barely even saw your photos. It's not social media friendly." I didn't say anything after that. I didn't post photos. I didn't talk about deployments. I stopped sharing. I stopped trying. It was easier that way. So there I was again, passport in hand, a silent marker of identity they barely cared about. If I'd relied on their recognition, maybe I'd buckle. But that passport didn't define me anymore. My strength didn't come from their acknowledgement. It came because I built something no one could erase. The next morning, I went for a run along the river. The city was waking up, cars rolling by, joggers breathing the cold air. I thought about the passport snug in my bag, something official but empty without the life behind it. I thought about the next steps, gathering evidence, contacting the lawyer, preparing statements. I thought about the future hearing where I'd stand present proof, not because I needed validation, but because I deserved justice. Back at my apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept the carved wooden box, the one they never touched. Now it held printouts, deployment logs, email traces, credit reports, K Street IP logs. Each document a chisel stroke in reclaiming my life. Each fact a counterweight to the emptiness they imposed on me. I added a new note at the front of the stack. If proving this makes me worthy, then let me be worthy of me, not them. I glanced at the passport again. I imagined the look on their faces when this quiet war ended, not with applause, but with recognition they couldn't ignore. their disbelief, their silence. And I knew I didn't need their approval. I never did. What I needed was my truth, and no one could steal that again. The truth, as it turned out, had layers. It started quietly, like most betrayals. A second notice from the bank arrived in the mail-thin envelope official header, the kind of letter you'd mistake for a tax update or account summary. But inside was something else entirely, a transaction alert from a commercial credit line linked to an LLC I had never heard of, with my name listed as a managing partner. The date was from 4 years ago. The signature on file matched mine to the letter. Not a version of it, my actual signature digitized and placed with surgical precision. I sat there for a minute, holding the page. My fingers twitched. I reread the transaction. A bridge loan for $2.5 million collateralized by company shares and guaranteed through a trust vehicle registered in Nevada. The name on the LLC wasn't familiar, but the parent company was Ellison Strategic Holdings, my family's corporate umbrella. I opened my laptop and began cross-referencing tax filings and incorporation records. The structure was murky, but the lines were clear enough if you knew what to look for. Ownership paths looping through shell entities, back to names I recognized. One of them was Emily's. Another was our father's. The paper trail was buried under layers of corporate law, but the key authorization email had been sent from an account I hadn't touched in years. My old Gmail, the one I used for grad school applications and Navy onboarding before they switched us to the secure server. I had forgotten it even existed, but someone hadn't. Someone had kept it active or at least recoverable. The authorization timestamp was a weekday morning in March 2019 while I was deployed in Djibouti. At that hour, I'd been at a forward base, helping coordinate drone surveillance. I wasn't in New York. I wasn't on any device with US access. And yet, according to that file, I had reviewed and signed a legal document from a Manhattan IP address. I checked the location history midtown, the exact same coordinates as my father's office. I didn't feel rage, not yet. I felt something colder. I started documenting. I printed every piece of evidence. I bought an encrypted hard drive and uploaded scans, email headers, metadata. I used forensic software I'd learned about through military briefings tools for identifying falsified timestamps and VPN reroutes. One signature had been copied and reused across multiple documents. Another showed signs of compression artifacts consistent with pasting over an older file. Someone had forged my digital presence so smoothly it had gone unnoticed by the bank. Worse, it had been accepted because, in their eyes, I was part of the family and the family trusted each other. Or so they claimed. One contract stood out a board consent letter, indicating I'd voted to approve a motion to liquidate a dormant subsidiary. The signature line read, Maya Ellison, Senior Partner. I had never even been to the building listed in the header. It was in Delaware, the favoured state for corporate games. My hands moved faster. I printed labelled, annotated. I created timelines and arrows colour-coded flowcharts of who signed what and when. The folder grew thick. Then I found the 2019 Power of Attorney document. I remembered signing something that year, basic paperwork for travel and emergency access to my account while I was abroad. My father had framed it as a precaution, just in case something happens out there, he said. What I hadn't realised was how he had used it as an open door. With that authority and with access to my old email, he'd essentially built a financial profile under my name, one I didn't control, but one that bore all the appearance of consent. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became this wasn't just one mistake. It was a system. A coordinated, long-term use of my identity as a shield, a name to float on risky ventures and fallback schemes. I looked up the legal terms: constructive fraud, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. Each word hit like a gavel. My father was not careless. He was deliberate. And Emily, Her login appeared in audit logs from the family office's server. She had downloaded files, forwarded PDFs, signed off on updates. Maybe she didn't read the fine print. Maybe she didn't care. I wasn't sure which was worse. What I did know was they had used me as a legal smokescreen, and now that the smoke was clearing, I had two options. Walk away quietly and let them keep what they stole, or build a case they couldn't ignore. The old me might have hesitated, might have thought about how it would look, how it might fracture the already brittle strings between us. But the woman holding that folder, the one with scars, medals, and an identity forged not on paper, but through sweat, silence, and duty, she didn't flinch. I stared down at the papers again, all those forged promises and lies in neat Helvetica. I flipped to a blank page, wrote "signed not mine," and circled it twice. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. I was no longer the missing daughter. I was the returning witness. And I had evidence to speak for me. I began my next move by digging into the trust documents I'd uncovered, the ones tied to my name. One in particular caught my eye, a revocable living trust set up years ago that named me as the primary trustee during my lifetime with Emily, listed as the successor beneficiary, but only if I was deemed unlocatable or legally incompetent for a full 24 months. My chest tightened when I realised the cut-off date was fast approaching. I traced the calendar back 24 months from March of last year, a time when I had been in isolation overseas, under orders unreachable by civilian communications, and that window had closed just weeks ago. The trust was legally triggered. I opened the document's revision history and saw a line that hadn't been there before, an amendment dated 1 month ago, quietly inserted, extending certain terms and loosening oversight conditions language that would give full control of the trust to Emily without outside scrutiny. No notification had been sent to me. No acknowledgement requested. It was as though I'd been declared legally erased. In plain terms, they had considered me disappeared, and they were in the process of assuming complete legal and financial control over my assets. They had pulled the trigger on the clause that used my absence to confiscate everything in my name. I sat back with a sharp exhale. This was far more insidious than a misused signature. This was a legal trap built around my life. I thought about the magnitude of it: investments, properties, shares, insurance, payouts, dividend rights, retirement funds, all funneling to Emily the moment my active status dipped below the threshold defined in the trust. All orchestrated without my knowledge. There were pieces I still needed: copies of Emily's communications surrounding the amendment, notarized records of their legal filings, and documentation showing the trust's executor or lack thereof. But I had the map now. I knew how deep it went, and I knew where it ended. My next step wasn't immediate confrontation, it was strategy. If I wanted to stop this quietly, I needed to act fast and pull back the curtain before the amendment could be fully executed. I drafted an email to my attorney, minimalist and precise. Subject: urgent family trust amendment, imminent asset transfer. In the body, I outlined the facts, pointed to the 24-month trigger, noted the April amendment dated 3 weeks ago, and asked for an injunction to halt any transfer of assets until I could be formally notified, and the amendment subject to my review. I saved the email as draft and switched gears. I started compiling evidence into a secure legal folder: trust files, amendment notices, time-stamped logs from my old email account server, access logs showing Emily's login during the amendment process. I blacked out sensitive family addresses, left only dates and names. It was methodical work, precise, calm, surgical. Late that evening, I packed the stack into my briefcase and drove to my attorney's office. As I walked down the hallway, my hand tightened around the documents. I thought about how this had begun a silent theft masked by legal phrasing, cloaked in familial loyalty. It was heartbreaking in a way, but also clarifying. They hadn't just written me out emotionally. They'd tried to write me out legally too. Inside the office, I signed the injunction form, watched my lawyer forward the request, and confirmed it would be filed in court before week's end. The trust companies handling Ellison Strategic Holdings would receive copies along with a notice that the assets were legally frozen pending dispute. Then, I drove home, letting my eyes adjust to streetlights instead of boardroom ceilings. My phone buzzed with an alert trust amendment. Injunction filed with county clerk followed by another from the trust company transfer, halted pending legal review. I shut the car door and stood in the parking garage for a moment silent. The echoes of my boots shifting in the echo chamber of concrete walls sounded like small victories. I'd laid a roadblock. I was turning legal wheels I didn't even know existed until recently. I had made them pause, and that pause gave me space to reclaim what was mine. At home, I unpacked the legal folder and left it on the coffee table. I didn't know how they'd react. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I had shifted the power. I had forced them to recognize me legally as a real person again, not a ghost, not a footnote. And that was essential. I sent a quick message to Emily, received document today. Let's resolve this like adults. I didn't expect a reply. I wasn't bluffing. I was setting boundaries. It was time to reveal that quiet war had become a decisive campaign. A few hours later, when I finally sat back at my desk and looked over the files, I felt the calm that comes after the hard part action. I'd drawn a line in legal stone, and now I waited for them to draw theirs. The next few weeks became a game of quiet escalation. I filed a civil lawsuit against Ellison Strategic Holdings and Ellison Family Office, naming my father Emily and the family's trust attorneys as defendants. My complaint detailed the unauthorized use of my identity, the forged documents the trust amendment made without my knowledge, and my claim for injunctive relief and damages. I served the papers personally to the family's legal counsel. Then I watched as the clock started ticking. Their response came swiftly. Within days, their attorney, a suited figure from a prominent law firm, filed a motion to dismiss. They admitted the trust amendment existed, but argued it was legally sound and that any miscommunication or timing discrepancies were the responsibility of Maya because I failed to update my contact information or respond to notices sent months ago. It was bureaucratic deflection, dressed in legal jargon failure to maintain accurate information in trust records. Reasonable efforts were made to contact Ms. Ellison. The amendments were procedural in nature. In other words, they blamed me for their own wrongdoing. They painted me as distant, unresponsive, hard to reach, framing my silence as the justification for their actions. Inside their statement, they included a small note. Our client regrets any distress this dispute may cause to family relations. I read it twice. That line, family relations, wasn't a statement of regret. It was a threat of public exposure of worst-case scenarios designed to intimidate. I didn't reply. I waited. I gathered more evidence. I consulted with my former intel team to cross-verify the email timestamps. I retrieved server access logs to show the amendments and logins from my father's IP addresses. I asked a forensic handwriting analyst to compare signature samples from archives, official commendations, diplomas, pay slips to the allegedly forged ones. I found internal trust department memos that questioned whether I had even been notified at all. I had packets of evidence bigger than my lawsuit filing. But I stayed silent. I let their motion sit without response until the court deadline forced them to request a hearing. I was ready. I had data, I had logs, I had independent witnesses, web administrators, notarizing attorneys, the signature analyst. I would not let their legal smoke and mirrors distract from the fact that they forged my voice literally and figuratively to erase me. At home, the first edges of tension crept into the household. Emily texted me after dinner one night. Hope we can work this out. Let me know if you want to talk. I didn't respond. Her silence said what her words didn't. She was waiting for my reaction, unsure of the rules now. Dad didn't bother. He stopped making small talk, stopped asking routine questions. Mum's wine glasses lingered longer. At one family gathering, I saw the trust attorney hovering at the edge, offering sympathetic nods to my parents, telling them they just want to protect a beloved daughter while subtly suggesting I was risking family harmony. But I stayed calm. I walked to the grocery store like any other day, ran errands, met a friend for coffee. I kept working on my case file by file, timeline by timeline. I rehearsed what I would say in court mornings, in a quiet civil building, not in a courtroom, technical, narrow, papered with precedents. The day of the hearing arrived. I took a deep breath, slipped into my suit, and left my apartment. I didn't look back at the files in the passenger seat. I walked into the courthouse lobby with the same steady steps I once took across academy halls, carrying the evidence that could dismantle a family empire. I didn't have to raise my voice. In the conference room, the opposing lawyer spoke first procedural. He emphasized how any dispute could have been avoided with simple communication. Then I presented access logs, email chains, timestamp discrepancies handwritten, and digital signature mismatches, printed scans, all arranged like a briefing board. There was no communication, I said, voice firm. Not from me, not from them. Their counsel shifted. They tried to argue oversight. I showed the memo where the trust officers had expressed concern that no notice had been received. I showed logs of the amendment documents uploaded to their server for review, yet never attached to any system-generated notice. I showed how the trust was set to transfer automatically if I was silent for 24 months, a clause executed purposely. It was cold, factual. Hard evidence matched claim after claim. The lawyer for the family fell silent. The judge leaned forward. I watched as understanding dawned on the faces around that room, my evidence dismantling the narrative they'd tried to build. When I finished, I closed the binder and looked at my own hands. No tremor. No need for drama. They had spoken for me. We left the hearing, my attorney and I, and walked into the courtyard. I realized the quiet war had shifted. They could still fight, still appeal, still leak stories to protect their image. But I had broken their control. Their first legal line had fallen. I drove home that evening. Their silence greeted me. Not absence, but none of those small pokes, that subtle noise of a family afraid to make eye contact. Emily's texts were gone. Their lawyer's threats had gone quiet. They were regrouping. I unpacked my tote bag and didn't feel the weight. I had turned their argument inside out, forced them to answer. And in doing so, I'd forced them to recognize my presence, not as a footnote, but as a person with options, identity rights, and consequences. I sat at the kitchen table and stared across the island toward the empty seat by the window, as though imagining someone sitting there. I didn't reach for the wine, didn't make a call. I just waited for their next move, for what this war would become next. A few days later, I found out about Aunt Claire's big birthday party. The invitation arrived at my doorstep. The Ellison family printed neatly on the envelope. Inside, a list of names, but mine wasn't on it, not even in small font. My name had been erased before they even pressed send. The party was held at my cousin Olivia's home, a grand house with a manicured lawn and white pillars. I recognized the photos on Emily's Instagram feed before I even opened the app. Laughter candles, family portraits strewn across the feed like trophies. She looked radiant in her designer dress. My parents were in several pictures posing with her. Connor, her boyfriend, stood beside her, arm around her waist. In none of them was there a hint of me. Not even an awkwardly empty chair. It struck me how erasing someone could feel like a clean surgery, no scars, no trace. But there were no scars left on me anymore, only the memory of their omission. That evening, I noticed a text from Olivia's daughter, my 7-year-old niece, Hannah. "Aunt Maya, Mom said you might be in trouble. Is that true?" My heart twanged not for me, but for her. That little girl trusted me. The implication that I was under investigation, their words not mine, hung in the air like a weapon. They were painting me as the dangerous one, the one to fear, the one to be excluded. And perhaps that generic phrase was enough to keep them safe, reputation intact. For a moment, I considered replying with a detailed explanation. But I'd been through that before, speeches, clarifications, defences, and none of it changed how they felt. Instead, I held her text without typing back. I needed to reclaim control of my presence, not chase after someone else's version of me. So, I took a photo the next morning, putting on my dress blues with precise care. Buttons, aligned medals, shining hair pulled back tight. I stood in front of the American flag at the local VFW hall, the summer sun streaming through the windows, flag rippling behind me. I snapped it myself, PTT click with no one else around. Then I tapped out a short response to Hannah. I'm serving, I'm fine, and I'm thinking of you. And I attached the photo, no explanations, just presence. Within half an hour, she replied, Auntie Maya, you're amazing. In her innocence, she saw me. That response knotted warmth inside me, tender, genuine, comforting, not tied to blood or obligations, but to truth. That night, I composed a brief post on my personal LinkedIn, not public, just connections. I posted the photo and wrote service, honour, truth, Maya Ellison, no explanation, no apology, no hashtag. Later, my phone buzzed. A connection request from Colonel Matthews, the man who had overseen my counter-intel team in Djibouti. His message was direct, saw your post. Proud of you, sister, you're not alone. It was a kindness rooted in shared hardship respect, earned in the field, not in boardrooms or curated family events. I closed my laptop, looked around the quiet of my living room. Their silence was still there, but now it felt different. It was less like a vacuum and more like a boundary line. Their world had its rules, expectations, roles. My world was something else entirely. Aunt Claire's party came and went. The posts faded, their stories moved on. A few days later, Emily sent an emoji-laden text, hope everything's okay. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence said what words couldn't. Under the noise of social updates, legal filings, family gossip, I found my own signal. I stood steady in my uniform with purpose. Their story could ignore me, but it couldn't overwrite me. In that quiet wake, I planned my next step. The table at Aunt Claire's was closed, but a new table waited, built on truth, evidence, and loyalty earned in sweat, not applause. The morning of my hearing, I walked onto the base with the weight of the moment pressing on my back. My dress uniform was crisp medals, aligned stripes ironing into my sleeves. I saw familiar profiles, officers I once trained with, juniors I once led. Some offered nods of quiet respect. Others stared with inscrutable faces. All knew why I was here. The hearing room was austere. A long table faced a panel of military adjudicators. At the table beside me sat my attorney Angela Ruiz, her eyes steady. Across the room, my father and his legal team looked oddly out of place in their suits. They were used to polished boardrooms, not this controlled environment. I didn't speak. The lawyers spoke for me. They presented documents I'd gathered, the bank memos forged, authorizations, account, histories, the trust documents, the email headers. Every piece built a chain of custody that led back to my father's office. Then came the bank officer's testimony. A stern woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. She had papers in her hand. I was instructed by Mr. Ellison to finalise a line of credit under Commander Ellison's name, she said, voice steady. I believed it was routine. He said it was approved by email. She paused, surveying the room. I saw no indication that Commander Ellison was involved in any of this financial documentation directly. That pause filled the room. My father reddened. My mother looked away. Emily, sitting beside him, glanced at her phone. The panel scribbled notes. I remained silent not out of weakness, but because silence now carried weight. It meant I had nothing to defend, nothing to hide. The documents weren't conjecture, they were facts. My lawyer closed her case. declared that the evidence suggested an abuse of both legal and familial trust, that my father had used my name and my absence to commit an elaborate betrayal. No rebuttal, no dramatic speeches, just silence that echoed louder than any justification they could offer. The hearing ended. I stood, took a respectful salute to the panel, then turned with Angela and walked toward the door. As we reached it, a low hum began to fill the hallway. At first, I thought it was HVAC. Then it grew expanded into a roar. Windows rattled, papers lifted from tables. The soft clack of boots sounded in the corridor. Hearing doors flew open. Civilians and military personnel widened their eyes. I stepped outside with Angela. The concrete tarmac lay ahead, and there, her silhouette clear against dawn light, was a grey military helicopter hovering inches above the ground, rotors churning air into a frenzy, dust and shreds of paperwork leaking against its hull. Behind me, my father froze. The crowd parted, staring. Emily's mouth dropped open. Mom gasped, covering her mouth with a hand. A young lieutenant appeared at the helicopter's side door. He scanned the assembled group, found me in the crowd, and strode forward. "Commander Ellison," he called. His voice cut through the rotor noise. "Transport secure. Our orders are to move you to the Joint Operations Command for immediate duty." He saluted. I returned it without hesitation. No one spoke. I stepped forward, helmet in hand. The wind whipped through my hair. I felt every gust as a gust of truth. This was my world, not theirs. A final look backward, my father's face, crestfallen mouth open in a silent question. Emily, staring raw, uncomprehending. Mum's tears shining unfiltered. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The helicopter's roar swallowed any explanation. I climbed inside. The door thumped shut. The rotors kicked into full speed. The base blurred beneath me as we lifted. The panel room became tiny. So did their world. I held onto the seat as we banked. My heart roared, no fear, just fierce resolve. I wasn't running from them. I was launching from the gravity they put on me. I was ascending into truth, justice, service. And in the distance, the grounds where they hosted that birthday, the polished halls of that family's selective ceremonies, they shrank into plains and roads. The helicopter reoriented. I stared at the tattered edges of paperwork, still drifting in the rotor wash, symbolic confetti of a broken lie. Then the base disappeared. Ahead of me, clouds parted. Duty called, and I answered. I was Commander Ellison, no longer background noise. I was reclaiming the narrative, one mission at a time. The helicopter descended behind the building where the hearing had just concluded. Rotors whipped swirling dust and tattered paperwork into chaotic spirals that mirrored the storm I'd stirred in my family. The tarmac stretched out a clean runway, separating me from the chaos behind me, a departure from their world, not just a relocation. I stepped off the ramp onto solid ground. The wind from the rotors tugged at my uniform. Medals rattled softly, ribbons fluttering like silent testimony. My boots hit concrete with purpose. Each thud was a declaration. I noticed eyes on me, some shocked, others confused, many respectful. I met none. I was focused, precise, yielding to the gravity of this moment. A young officer in crisp fatigues approached, no hesitation in his posture. He presented a folder clad in authority. Commander Ellison, orders from command. We're wheels up in 5, he said, calm yet firm. I took it as letting its weight settle, a tangible acknowledgement of my authority. Silence rippled through the onlookers. My father's lips parted, ready to call my name. Maya, he started, but I was no longer Maya. I was a commander, and that identity belonged to nobody but me. I turned slowly toward him, feeling the rotor wind strip me bare of everything that wasn't me, expectations, insults, lopsided assumptions. I held his gaze firmly. I have orders, I said, voice steady. No plea, no emotion, simply fact. My words hit harder than any shout. Emily's mouth hung open, stunned. Her carefully practiced sugary smile, the kind that looked perfect for cameras, now trembled. Was this the first time she realised I wasn't a quiet backup sister, that my silence held fire? Mum stood stiff, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. It took a moment before I recognised that her lips weren't shaped in reproach. They trembled with something like fear that she had misread me all these years. The officer shifted eyes on me, waiting. The world around us became a tableau of disbelief and awe. Legal counsel caught off guard, military panel members, uncertain, my family, fracturing under the weight of recognition. I didn't pause. I stepped forward. Concrete gave way to the helicopter's ramp. The corridor of roaring wind closed behind. Inside, the noise intensified, but everything fell into narrow focus. Lieutenant Jennings sat ready, face blank, but respectful. I dropped beside him, folder in hand. Medals resting on my chest, I felt them press both pride and proof. I looked down at the badge USNA, my alma mater. My beginnings, now a present reality. Jennings nodded. Destination, Joint Operations Command. ETA, 2 hours. I nodded back. Understood. No need to elaborate. The mission spoke louder than words. The rotor blades kicked the earth, propelling us forward. Through the open hatch flashed images of the base below, receding. There, my father mid-stride, still in the doorway, frozen like a statue. Beside him, Emily's face drained of colour. Mum's eyes glistened, not tears exactly, but something caught halfway: realisation, regret, shock. They stood small, so small under the rising chopper. I felt the cabin tilt. The ground fell away. I was climbing physically and emotionally into a new altitude of my own making. The folder rested on my lap, documents, evidence, authority. I touched the leather cover, letting the weight ground me. Commander Jennings said quietly, "Director's office on secure line. They need your briefing package before we land." I glanced down. Inside the folder were attachments signed, affidavits, account trails, trust instruments, hearing transcripts, names and actions of who tried to erase me, lies laid bare. I closed my eyes momentarily and inhaled deep. Helicopter vibration under me felt almost meditative. I realised that this moment, as condensed as it was, contained everything I'd lived: rejection, betrayal, endurance, now elevation. Below, the ground shrunk: the hearing room, the tarmac, the dust. Further away, suburban streets, childhood homes must have been birthdays and graduations. They were becoming landscapes of yesterday. I opened my eyes. Cloudlight painted soft gold across the cabin. Ahead, a secure base appeared on the horizon. Somewhere inside awaited briefing officers, intelligence analysts' missions waiting on my debrief. I was ready. No longer invisible, no longer sidelined. I was Commander Ellison. I sat upright, set the folder on my seat. The helicopter banked. The world shifted beneath me. I held firm. Behind me, in that now small corner of the world, my family remained frozen in realization that they hadn't just written me off. They'd underestimated me. And now they watched me leave on their terms, duty-bound, unbowed. And I soared. Touchdown came quietly, far from cameras and family drama, on a secure runway just outside the Pentagon. The hum of rotors faded as I stepped out my boots, touching down on earth that felt both foreign and familiar. A courier handed me 2 envelopes, one thick paper embossed with a unit crest, the other a clean, no-logo printout from an official .mil address. I recognized the handwriting on the first. Inside was a note from Major Carter, the man who'd served under me during our last deployment in Djibouti. He was one of the first to spot the inconsistencies when I disappeared from family events. He wrote, "Thank you for not standing down, for not letting their doubt define you. I saw what you led us through. I carry your confidence forward every day. No flourish, just a simple acknowledgement. that it mattered what I'd done and who I'd been, regardless of what my family thought. I folded the note thoughtfully, tucking it into a pocket where it wouldn't get lost among ceremonies or briefings. But the second message demanded my attention. It was short, 3 lines. Commander Ellison. You are not alone. Joint Chiefs awaiting debrief. No need to embellish. It closed with a Pentagon signature stamp. No mire, no informal tone, just acknowledgement proof that an institution far larger than my family recognized me for what I was. A leader, a commander, someone whose service carried weight beyond any family snub. I stood looking at those lines, breathing in the crisp military-grade air. Around me, uniformed personnel moved with purpose. The energy here was not about expectations, but about mission. I'd left behind everything familiar and the remains of those entanglements, so I could step into a world that measured me by standards I understood. My truth wasn't erased. It was validated. Pulling out my phone, I typed a brief reply to Major Carter. I couldn't let it stand. Proud to have led proud to stand with you. I saved the email from the Pentagon, flagged as urgent. I mentally prepared for what came next. It wasn't a return to the comforts of home, but a step further into the role I'd earned, the role I was prepared for. I looked up at the sky visible through the hangar door and let the weight of silence fill the moment. I wasn't celebrating. This wasn't victory, but it was something stronger, clarity, purpose. The knowledge that the remains of doubt left behind in dusty living rooms, in sidelong glances, no longer had a hold on me. Behind me, the tactical team assembled. Ahead of me, a briefing room waited. This letter and email marked the end of one chapter and the threshold of the next. I squared my shoulders, feeling the familiar comfort of uniform fabric across my chest. In that moment, I felt equipped not only to proceed, but to emerge from these remains stronger than ever. Now, 6 weeks later, I stood at the front of a classroom inside an old brick building on the edge of the Naval Intelligence Training Compound. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of new recruits in pressed uniforms and fresh ambition. This wasn't just any class. It was the latest cohort of intelligence officers training for covert operations, a program I'd once been a part of. Dark eyes watched me expectantly. I inhaled, steadying my breath the same way I had hundreds of times before a mission briefing. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating my uniform, the insignia, the ribbons, the rank that carried weight I'd earned. I swallowed the years of doubt and dismissal my family had cast my way, and I spoke. Good morning. I'm Commander Maya Ellison. Welcome to day one of your officer training. I launched into the syllabus tradecraft, situational awareness, cybersecurity, field operations. Each slide and example carried the gravity of experience, not theory. I spoke of pressure, of silence, of resilience, and as I spoke, I wasn't just teaching. I was standing for every young woman, every recruit who'd ever felt unseen. Mid-train one recruit raised her hand. She looked nervous, shoulders tight, voice soft. Mom, did you ever want to quit? Her question clicked in my chest. I paused, assessing a sea of earnest faces. Then I answered with quiet conviction every single day. But I never did. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then heads nodded appreciatively. She exhaled. I added, resilience is rarely about doing the extraordinary. It's about showing up day after day, even when the world says you don't belong. It was the truth. My story wasn't just about reclaiming my name from my family. It was about standing firm when the world didn't expect me to. Toward the end of the session, I walked to the whiteboard, marker in hand. A single phrase, my name, my way. It was the collection of years I'd gathered, faith in my identity forged in conflict, not conformity. I underlined my name the letters, steady hawkish. Then I closed the loop, drawing a confident line under my way. I took a step back, meeting each pair of eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. My posture, my gaze, my command of the room said everything I belonged here. I had always belonged. That afternoon, after class, I stood outside the building, hands behind my back uniform, crisped the soft hum of afternoon traffic in the distance. Some recruits lingered to ask questions. Others simply observed in respectful silence. I answered them all. No social media posts, no parental approvals needed, no validation from anyone whose pride hinged on boardroom deals, family brands, or pre-scripted narratives. For the first time, I realized I had built a legacy that wasn't defined by acceptance. It was defined by action, by staying true to myself and by refusing to disappear. I tucked the marker into my pocket and walked down the corridor, passing portraits of past directors of alumni of heroes in uniform. I didn't glance at the photographs. My path wasn't theirs, but it ran parallel devoted service, quiet leadership, unwavering integrity. As I stepped outside into the sun, I heard the chime of a message. I checked my phone, a notification flagged urgent training files uploaded. Another from Major Carter. See you at the next module. I pocketed the phone. I'd have responses later. In this moment, I simply allowed the weight of silence to settle, an emblem not of erasure, but of resolve. I walked toward the parking lot. Boots on gravel, head held high. I understood what my family never could, that silence when wielded by a person who refuses to shrink becomes its own kind of voice. I've spent a lifetime learning that lesson. I finally speak through purpose. I didn't need them to believe in me, because I already had. Sometimes, the people you want recognition from never give it. Sometimes the apology doesn't come, the seat at the table isn't offered, and your name is left off the list on purpose. But here's what I've learned. You don't need their permission to be whole. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel invisible, maybe because you chose differently, loved differently, dreamed differently, then I want you to hear this. You are not alone. Your path doesn't need to be loud to matter. Your resilience doesn't need to be flashy to be powerful. These days, more and more people are walking away from roles they were never meant to play, jobs, families, even entire communities, just to return to themselves. Some do it through therapy. Others find it in art, in movement, in quiet mornings, where they write their own names in a notebook just to remember they're still here. Healing isn't always about mending old ties. Sometimes it's about building something that never relied on them in the first place. So, if you're still finding your voice still standing at the edge of a room, wondering if you'll ever be seen, just know this someone out there already sees you. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's the version of you who never stopped trying. And if this story spoke to you, if you saw a part of yourself in Maya or found a moment that made you pause, feel free to stay connected. Subscribe, follow, share with someone who might need it. This space is for all the quiet fighters out there. We hear you, and we're not going anywhere.